Welcome to the AHR podcast, where we engage in captivating conversations about the built environment and its influence on shaping a more positive future. My name's Gurminder Sanghera, a director at AHR, but more importantly, I'm an architect. I'm passionate about seeing positive change in our built environment in response to climate change and how carbon reduction plays an important role in tackling this. When we consider the billions of tons of carbon produced through creating new buildings globally, it puts a sharp focus on how we can better utilise, transform, and reinvent our existing buildings. So, in today's conversation, I'm joined by my colleagues Rob and Simon from AHR, and I'll allow them to introduce themselves. So, Simon, do you want to go first?
Thanks, Jim. Hi, I'm Sam Lamprell, Regional Director at AHR based in Birmingham. For my sins, I've been working on a number of existing building refurbishment, reuse projects over some years now, and I find those particularly interesting with the challenges that they throw up.
Thank you, Simon, and look forward to discussing some of those case studies in a bit more detail. Rob, over to yourself.
Hi, Jim. Thanks so much for inviting me to come and have a chat with you. So I'm Robert Hopkins. I'm with AHR based in the northwest of England, and my relevance to today's conversation, I'm the head of sustainability for AHR. So I've been championing lots of our initiatives over the last few years. I'm actively involved in the higher education sector, and particularly around Manchester, Liverpool, Preston. We've been doing lots of reuse projects over the last few years. So there's loads of really interesting things to share on those. And over the last year or so, I've developed the AHR decarbonisation toolkit, which is it's the answer to all our problems.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to exploring a bit more about this solution to all of our problems, Rob. So let's kickstart this with actually having a quick chat around why reinvention is so important. So I guess, Rob, do you want to just touch on why you feel that it's so important?
Yeah, and I think, without wanting to sort of, be too doom and gloom about this, to sort of set the context of why this conversation's taking place. We had an Act of Parliament that came through in 2008 that said that the UK was committed to being a net zero carbon country, and then that was updated in 2019 to actually put some much firmer dates and deadlines on that. It said that we would be a net zero carbon country by 2050. So, that was essentially gave us all notice, 31 years to get from where we were then to where we need to be. Importantly for this conversation, though, in terms of our built around environment and what's around us, that doesn't mean that we're going to start again. We're going to rebuild the UK from scratch over those years. There's loads and loads of buildings that are amazing. They are the character of the United Kingdom, and we want that character to stay. So about 80% of our buildings will still be with us in 2050. And so the conversation has to move very quickly from skill sets in how you deal with very, very low energy buildings in new buildings to how we actually adapt what we've already got and get us on track to where we need to be. And it's pretty simple, really. As a country, we need to be using a lot less energy. We've got a strategy in place, and it can change from who you speak to, whether it's 2030 or 2035, that our electricity grid will be decarbonised by that point, which is really great news. And don't underestimate, we're making really, really great progress with that as well. There's loads and loads of new initiatives that come on board every year, so we're doing really well there, so we shouldn't beat ourselves up. Crucially, though, we get 170 gigawatts a day from our gas supply that comes into the UK, and we've got to wean ourselves off that 170 gigawatts. We've got 60 gigawatts capacity at the moment in the electricity grid. We're going to grow that to about 95, there or thereabouts. So what we really need to think about is essentially more than halving the amount of energy that gets used in the UK. So we can't simply change from one energy supply to another. We've got to fundamentally look at how we can actually treat our buildings to kind of turn the dials down on how much energy that they're actually using.
Mm, mm. And so I guess, taking that into consideration, our buildings need to go on a bit of a diet, don't they, in terms of
Yeah,
how they're
yeah.
vastly consuming all these resources. But that also brings me to another point that you kind of raised about the importance of character. Now, in terms of, I'm going to pose this one to Simon because, I know you've been involved in some really interesting projects. Can you talk a bit about the role of conservation and heritage of a place and how that plays into this whole idea and ethos of what we're doing with our existing building stock and keeping that unique importance of character in the UK?
I think that's absolutely right, Jim. I think reusing some of these existing buildings helps us preserve that sense of place, the heritage of an area, the things that we don't want to lose, the character of a region. So by using some of those existing buildings, repurposing them, it gives us that opportunity to build on that and preserve it, enhance it, and make them fit for purpose for now and for the future.
And I guess an important part of that then is also how that can help improve not only environmental or social, but also economic sustainability in regions. In some of the projects we're looking at, have either of you come across clients who are starting to put a bit of a sharper focus on some of these issues?
It's really tough. It is really tough when you get into the building economics, and there is no hiding place as far as I'm concerned. Early on in these discussions, people have naively suggested it'll cost you no more money to save all this energy. Well, that's not really correct. You need to put something in to be able to get something out, and that's something we've worked really hard on, is making sure that those paybacks are actually realistic. And so it's not reliant upon philanthropy and doing the right thing. It actually makes economic sense for people as well. And we've got net zero carbon buildings that are on site at the moment, and the debt funding on those now is directly connected to the performance of that building on completion. So the interest rate almost doubles if we don't achieve the net zero carbon rating, because essentially funds are now saying, enough is enough. We've got to get these toxic assets off our, out of our portfolios. We need to act responsibly, and we need to encourage all of our clients to act responsibly too.
I suppose, Jim, there's other economic benefits as well by refurbishing buildings, repurposing them. Can generate and enhance the local economic situation in a place. So, for example, we're working in Lichfield at the moment, where we're working on a former Debenhams building. And what's interesting there was that the Debenhams, like the M&S in that city, shut, leave big holes in the city centre, and we've got big units there are big units in there, and it had big impact then back into that local environment, because we then have that overall perception of the city centre to use as occupiers, landowners, where we've got vacant buildings, and what are they doing? And really interesting on this project, we're taking that former Debenhams building and then repurposing that back as a cinema and F&B leisure space. It's got terraces on the upper levels overlooking Lichfield, but that has much wider economic benefits for that as a place. And with that scheme, we're also improving the quality of public realm adjacent to the building. And a big part of this is encouraging inward investment back in and growth of the wider area there.
And I think, you've just hit the nail on the head there. There are so many of these buildings, aren't there, out there that are posing a problem for landlords, owners, even tenants and occupiers, in that they're within buildings that are very inefficient. And some of these buildings are now being termed as stranded assets, aren't they? And people are becoming more and more concerned about how they can continue to operate from these premises, or even if they will, following government legislation, be able to let out some of these premises in the near future. And I recall, it was only a short while ago, I think it was early last year, I came across the Jeffreys report that kind of downgraded British Land and land security from buy to hold for investors. Now that's pretty telling in itself, isn't it? When you've got financial implications like that from a real estate perspective, to say that these buildings are problem buildings, they're toxic assets, I think is the word that you use, Rob. So taking that into consideration, what value then would you say an architect brings to some of these schemes in terms of what we're doing? And I guess, Simon, you were touching on that, weren't you, in terms of how you were reusing an existing building?
Yeah, so I guess we've looked at a number of schemes in the Midlands where we've been asked to take an existing building and investigate how we could repurpose it and take it forward. And a lot of this comes down to, are the bones of that building right? The floor to floor heights right? There's certain things that you can change when you start to design. So you can introduce light wells, you can change facade potentially if it's not listed building. But adjacent buildings, views out, are some of the things you can't change. The position of the sun and the way the sun comes around, the volume of the building, sometimes you can change. So what we often do is then look at the building holistically. We'll do an analysis and then look at what is right to go back into the building. How can we get best value? On another project, we did an extensive piece of work. So a project we've currently got in planning at the moment. So it's 92 and 93 New Street. So this was it's a listed building. It's in the conservation area. So it's got some challenging constraints already around the existing building. The building was built 1865 as a Masonic hall, and then it had been converted in 1929 into a cinema. So it had already gone through a evolution and a repurposing in its own right. And then end of the 80s, the cinema was no longer viable, so that closed, and since then it's been redundant. The lower floors had then taken over the building and been used as retail, and they'd expanded upwards at the loss of the upper floors within that building. So when we got asked to look at that building, it was, well, what can we use this building for? The circulation in the building just didn't work anymore. It had been cut off, so you can't actually get up through the building easily. So we needed to come up with a new solution for vertical circulation, but also what goes back into the building. So we started looking at volumetrically what could fit in the building, where the light is, what different uses could give us back economically and for the client in terms of rental values. And we looked at a whole range of uses, from theatre back to cinema, residential, hotel, conference facility, casino, and office. And through a kind of detailed appraisal of each of those, we've developed now an office scheme, which was the best fit for the building because of where we could put windows and floors and aspect and route in, but also what that would give us back in rental value. And we could use some of the lofty spaces that were in the building for some interesting workspaces. So yeah, that's been a fascinating project. But I think the key for this is really getting the bones of the building right. Once the bones of the building are right, you can fit in different uses quite easily. So the key challenge is the vertical circulation and daylight primarily.
I mean, that is really fascinating, actually, because just from you describing that journey you went through, the brief fundamentally adapted in a way, didn't it? in terms of even how you adapted the building to actually realise what would actually fundamentally work within the constraints of the existing building and what it could allow you to achieve. So, I mean, Rob, in terms of some of the things that Simon's just been touching on then, how important will reinvention be in our efforts to kind of decarbonise, from your perspective and perhaps a bit on your decarb toolkit, which is the saviour to our problems, as you've described it.
So yeah, not wanting to sort of overstate saving the planet there, Jim. But I think what we often underestimate as architects the level of optimism that we bring to any project, and clients generally really love that optimism, and that brings energy to projects, and when you've got energy, people can steer the way through problems. You mentioned the decarb toolkit thing that I developed a year or so back, and essentially that was to actually put a bit of science behind our optimism when we have early conversations with people, and again, whilst the kind of the background, all the physics in the background were in a way is all pretty complex on the tool. It's a very approachable way of looking at buildings, and it doesn't matter what typology they are. And it was the epiphany moment that we were working on looking at decarbonising a building, and the engineer that we were working with needed to build up this environmental model. They wanted 4 weeks to build the model in the first place, and then a further 2 weeks to then input our data for our ideas about what to do with the building. And as I said, the epiphany came, a conversation with an agent in Manchester. He's like, well, I need to know the answer tomorrow morning. I've got people who want to put in an offer on this building, and they need to know, can we get to net zero carbon if we buy this building? So we took the engineering out of the engineer's hands, essentially, and said, let's use the expertise that we've got within our practice, and it's not exclusive to our practice. Anybody who's a passive house designer could have done exactly the same thing. And we essentially used the physics that's in a PHPP model, where we could simplify that down to some very basic pieces of data that would be input. Those pieces of data would be available when you were doing a feasibility anyway on a building. And so while Simon was talking about efficiency, looking at cores, about moving better and about experience in those buildings, we actually wanted to put a little bit of science behind that as well, and say, actually, you'll get from an energy use of X down to Y by simply making those interventions. And again, from a commercial perspective, what was really important was that we could dial in and dial out options as that conversation was taking place at the table. It's like essentially having a piece of scientific tracing paper in front of you. So we can trace those scenarios out in the tool, and come up with a reasonable sketch there, and then to say it'll probably use about this much energy. That then it's giving people confidence that they can do something with a building they've already got, or a building that they want to acquire, which is great. It also means that it gives them confidence that they can base that around lease events, and so they don't have to do everything at the same time. They can essentially develop a little bit of a passport for that building that says, if we want to get to X energy use in 2024 to Y energy use in 2030, we can do these interventions as these leases come up. So we don't need a full run at the building. We can do it, but we've got a plan in place to actually make it happen, and we know where we'll get to in the end. We know that then it'll be net zero carbon, and we know that we've got the confidence that that demand for net zero carbon space in whichever city can be satisfied. And so and it's not just limited to commercial buildings. We're looking at schools, we're looking at universities, we've got gallery spaces, we've got council buildings. We're building up this really interesting compendium of projects. And again, the findings from there are really, really quite startling that, investment is required, but that investment is a lot more modest than people actually think because we're not sitting there with a shopping list of top shelf components. We're actually being quite pragmatic about actually using our knowledge that we've developed through our kind of profession.
That's really interesting, actually, in terms of the approach and the way in which it works, because you're saying that this is not really replicating what the engineers do because they're doing a much more detailed study, but what this gives you is a simplified model, which gives you the speed and agility through the software to provide a very quick answer. So the fact that you were able to, am I right in saying within like a 24 to 48-hour period, you were able to turn around some initial responses?
Yeah, and
Wow.
that's
Okay.
why I call it. It's why I try and describe it as a piece of tracing paper because the detailed modelling that engineers are doing at later design stages is still, that will always be required. It'll always be relevant, but that level of detail isn't always appropriate when you're walking down the street, as we often do in Manchester or Liverpool, looking at buildings and talking about the art of the possible with people. We've not always got 6 months to kind of think about the art of the possible. Sometimes it's only 6 hours.
So I guess with, that opens up opportunities when you're considering, acquisitions, carrying out feasibility studies, when you just want a very quick kind of pragmatic review with some kind of data-based decision-making process in place. I think that's probably where it's starting to really come into itself, would you say?
And don't get me wrong, it's not always good news.
No. Better the devil you know, though, I guess.
It's not.
It's better to know that it's going to cost too much money to get to those levels before you buy it than after you buy it. And look, some buildings are just inherently going to be easier to get to net carbon zero, to refit, to repurpose than others because their configuration allows an easier, simpler adaptation. And I think the other point Rob made earlier, that we're seeing quite a bit this pathway to net carbon zero. So people setting out a route of how you achieve a long-term goal over a period of time.
Yeah, I mean, I call them passports, but that for me, that data has to stay with the building, regardless of who's designed a piece of it, who's owned a piece of it. We've got to get into this mentality that those buildings deserve to have accurate data that stays with the building and not with the people, and it can get lost. I mean, again, a course of events that we've seen over the last 6 months in Manchester is the heritage conversation has now started to evolve quite significantly. We were looking at a listed building and some essentially interventions to reduce the energy use on that existing building from 343 kilowatts a square metre an hour down to 180. And the starting point for the heritage officer was, you can't do that. Our response to that was, we completely respect that position that you want to take, but this building is not going to have a future in 5 years. It was costing over £200,000 a year just to keep the heating on in the building. That had doubled because of the energy crisis. And it's not sustainable to think that these buildings just look great. They have to perform well. Otherwise, they're just going to be unusable by people. And so our kind of position with the heritage offer was to show them scientifically, visually the building isn't going to change. The detail might not be quite as honest as where it was 100 years ago when the building was constructed, but it's going to use half as much energy, so it stands half a chance of having another 50 years left in the tank. At the moment, I think it's got less than 5 years, and people will just mothball it and walk away because it was just costing too much to actually be in the building.
I mean, I've just in line with what you've just said there, I've had some really interesting conversations with some developer clients and friends who are sat on a considerable portfolio, and the portfolio managers are quite concerned about, the longevity of some of their buildings and the kind of energy consumption and what they need to do to kind of green that portfolio up to attract future investment. Is this something that Simon, you've been working on a lot of kind of commercial developments in and around Birmingham and that wider region, that you're now being asked questions around some of these points that Rob's making about, the energy consumption, what tenants want, and what's the art of the possible, should I say, with some of these buildings?
ESG is now really key. It's top of the agenda in terms of the want list. And as Rob says, the funders are absolutely all over this. They know where this is going. They need to improve building performance, up the scale from EPC, wherever it sits at the moment. We're seeing some buildings down at E, and getting those to C and B, and as you said earlier, that the stranding of buildings and avoiding buildings being stranded, which is this concept of they just won't be able to be let out if they don't achieve the right certification. So yes, that is absolutely key, and we're seeing all sorts of measures being done to achieve that. On a listed building, just going back to Rob's comment on the listed building, we've been working on listed buildings, getting those up to EPCA and looking at net carbon zero. The challenge for us is still around the funding of those in the commercial sense and achieving net carbon zero. And we're seeing people defaulting to maybe EPCA on some schemes as opposed to net carbon zero, but it's still pretty good standard.
I think there's going to be a lot of, the spotlight certainly on this, and in terms of what's being done in terms of shaping local planning policy, I guess, as well, to feed into this, right? Because, I think we appreciate the importance of retaining the characteristics of heritage buildings, especially in conservation areas, and what you can actually do in terms of reducing the amount of kind of carbon that they're consuming from, keeping them ventilated and warm. Is this something that, from a viability perspective, where there's a real tension between, say, maybe perhaps the private sector, who have aspirations of what they want to do with buildings and planning policy on, say, a grade 1 or grade 2 listed building, where you're kind of at loggerheads with trying to retain a building and its use, and do something innovative with it, whereas planning policy is pushing back and maybe not as pro-development or progressive in their thoughts?
So I guess we had one example, the New Street project I talked about earlier, where we were looking to improve the building thermally. It was very good EPCA. Part of that was having internal insulation incorporated to some of the heritage areas, which we did get knocked back on. However, we were still able to achieve an EPCA, given all the other measures that we're doing to the building. So we haven't actually got to that position where the two are not working. We have found a solution.
That's reassuring to know. So they are becoming a bit more progressive.
Just picking up on one of Simon's points there. I think, as architects, we've got to be really, really careful as well with these buildings. It might have been a skill set that's been in hibernation for quite a long time because there's been so much of a focus on new buildings. But once we start looking at significantly improving the performance of existing buildings, and we're making quite major adjustments to the fabric of those buildings, then the building comes back to life in terms of its physics, and it starts thinking to itself, where's my dew point going to be now? What's going to happen with all this humidity? How am I going to get fresh air into these spaces? And so I don't think we can underestimate that our skill set doesn't just stay on a piece of tracing paper in terms of what we can do to improve that performance. It's really, really important that what sits alongside that is essentially, is reinvigorating our expertise in actually genuinely understanding how U values work, genuinely understanding infiltration, undertaking, some pretty major thermal bridge calculations. And so we know that when we give a 200-year-old building another 100 years of life, that's a happy 100 years for it. It's not 100 years that means that it degrades very quickly because it's getting damp and mould and all sorts of things in the wrong places.
Mm, mm. So, I mean, in taking that into then consideration, at what point then are we finding when we're kind of carrying out some of these kind of feasibilities and assessments, do we make the decision whether to reuse or rebuild? Have we had some difficult decisions to make on some projects, or are there influences that are pushing us one way or the other at a certain stage?
I think for me, you've got to assess each building on its own merits. There isn't a one size fits all solution for that. It's not like you could say, every building between 1930 and 1940 should get demolished, or because with every age that we've seen where we've had flurries of construction, there's been great buildings have been created, great architecture, and not so great buildings and architecture created. And it's when the tide goes out that you actually see how good those buildings really are. I think what might be quite surprising to some people is that there'll be buildings that are less than 10, 20 years old that we actually reach a position where we're probably better off without those. And there'll be other buildings that are much older that we think, well, actually it's going to be much easier to adapt that building to where we need to be in terms of our net zero economy. So I'm genuinely really excited about, what I think is going to be a great age of architecture now over the next 20 years where, our skill set, it won't be, AI won't be able to make those decisions. BIM technology won't be able to make those decisions. That's about our education and about being thoughtful, about being creative, but also being pragmatic with science as well.
I do think, Rob, as we go forward, we'll need to build a bigger case now if we want to demolish a building.
Yeah.
And that case needs to stand, whereas probably 10, 15 years ago, you kind of look at it and go, oh, that building's going to be dropped. Now,
Yeah.
I think
that's the default position now in London, isn't it?
And now it's, the default is, well, what can we do with the existing building? And then once we've really had a good look at it and a creative look at it, if it doesn't then work.
I think and again, we're seeing planning policy in London, and that'll come to Birmingham and it'll come to the Northwest, where the default position is you can't get rid of that building, but we will be much more forgiving in terms of how you can actually make that site viable, economically viable. And so that might mean adding a few more stories on it, might mean that you can add a few more interventions here and there. And, and already we're seeing in London the planners are cutting people a little bit more slack if they're, actually working with a building rather than trying to justify getting rid of something.
There's some really interesting examples as well, aren't there, out there in terms of briefs that come in on new projects for how we can repurpose a building for a specific function. I mean, we've worked on one recently and just completed it, where it was the old Yorkshire Building Society offices within a conservation area in the heart of Leeds city centre. Now, I can't think of a more sustainable place to put a new school, because you've got fantastic transport links, etc., allowing everyone to travel in a sustainable manner into school, not requiring your parents to drop you off, because there's lots of different transportation nodes there. You've got buses, you've got trains, etc., coming in. And then you've got access to the wider city as well. And so we've just finished completing the new Leeds Maths School in that building. And it goes back to some of the points and challenges that I think you were talking about, Simon, about was that building the most suitable type of building to accommodate this new brief? And yes, it had its challenges in terms of what we could do with the facade and fenestration of that building, because it sat within a conservation area, and we were trying to meet new kind of specification requirements for airtightness and thermal efficiency, and taking into consideration acoustics. That was important for a school setting within a city centre environment. But we managed it, and we worked with the building, and we found that actually the resulting solution probably provides a much more vibrant and innovative solution than what a new build could have in the same place. And it's about retention of heritage and character of an area. And I think that's a real feel-good story for everyone who's been involved in that project. But we've looked at some wildly different projects as well. Rob, tell me a bit about this vertical farm that you mentioned a while back to me. That's an interesting one.
Yeah, so I mean, again, for me, not every project is always about the realisation of that project. It's sometimes about taking clients on a journey about the art of the possible. And this was something we looked at briefly for the University of Liverpool, where they had an existing building that's on their campus that's not been occupied now for some years, except for pigeons. It's not a listed building, but it's a handsome building. It's a Basil Spence building. I wouldn't call it a top marks Basil Spence building, but nonetheless, it is a well-proportioned Basil Spence building. And essentially, they'd abandoned ship, and they were just waiting for it to fall down. It has reached a point where it's beyond an economic state of repair, but it's still got another 10, 15 years of life left. Those 10 and 15 years won't necessarily be for people to inhabit that building for education purposes, but it's a building on site nonetheless. And so what we looked at with the university there was, if we actually took those floor plates on the tower and inserted a farm essentially into the middle of the university. The reasons for doing that were twofold. One was so it would send a very strong message out to students and academics to say that that we really care and that we're really creative in the way that we think about reusing buildings. It's not always going to be just reusing it as a building the way that it had previously been used. And then it was also then thinking about, how do you bring food into cities? How do you really look at the amount of carbon that's in food? And what interventions can we make that really kind of break the cycle that we're in? It's a mess of a cycle that we're in. So the urban farm essentially meant that we would be growing food right in the middle of an area of the city that has 9,000 people arrive every day into that place. So rather than grow food on a farm and then distribute it to a city, by being able to grow it there where the people are, they then became the distribution network, because they were already located where the farm was. They could collect food whilst they were on campus and then take it back to their domestic environment. So it took a few key pieces of the jigsaw out of the kind of the cycle for food production and the number of miles and carbon miles that food have. It also meant that the halls of residence on site, God forbid that we talked about students getting a free salad box delivered every morning to each student apartment. So again, kind of being able to open up the conversation about what constitutes a healthy mind starts with a healthy diet.
Well, that really is a fascinating example. Really, really interesting. Thank you for that, Robin. And Simon, Colmore Row, I've seen some really stunning images of a project you worked on over there. Do you want to talk a bit about that?
So I guess we've worked on a couple of projects on Colmore Row, both refurbishment of listed buildings. Perhaps just talk on the 81 Colmore Row Chatwin Building. That's listed building, built 1870. It was extensively refurbished in 1890 and converted into RBS Bank, and Our client bought it 3 years ago and looked to refurbish that and bring it up to standards and bring it up to a spec which was fit for purpose, fit for its location. And I suppose the key with that was by us going in, analysing what was there, making use of its existing features, and then developing a design which worked with, though, took those best features, but sorted out all the problems and gave it a new lease of life that will now take it forward over the next period. It's been really interesting. And I think going back to what you said about your project in Leeds, which was about working with a building, and I think for me the best refurbishment, repurposing projects grow out of the existing building. So they take the best bits, the best characters, and then develop a new language from that is so inextricably linked and connected back that ultimately you can't imagine one without the other. And I think that's where it becomes the best piece of architecture.
Totally agree with you there, Simon. Brilliant. Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground there, and there've been some really interesting kind of observations and comments made about our approach. And I think it's a brave new world out there, isn't it? And in terms of how we look at things in a very ethical way, and also in a very innovative way, in how we can kind of reshape using the existing built environment. So I just want to take the opportunity to thank you, Rob and Simon, for taking part in the conversation today. And to our listeners, thank you. And we hope you enjoyed this episode. You can find all podcast episodes on our website. We can subscribe via your preferred podcast platform. So thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to you joining us again next time.